Welcome on behalf of the Humanities Institute to Conversation on Sports as part of our Sports at Humanities Institute initiative. And I'm Ron Broglio, the director of the Institute, here to welcome Alexander Regier, who is the William Faulkner Endowed Professor of English and the chair of the English department at Rice University. And I've known Alexander for many years in Romanticism, 19th century British and German Romanticism. His work as a through line is the body and problems with the body. So his early work was Fracture and Fragments in British Romanticism with Cambridge University Press. And then later, Exorbitant Enlightenment, Blake and Hamann on an Anglo-German Constellation with Oxford. And that one really was, a lot of his work looks at minute particulars, materialities and particularities, and even abnormalities within the body that, when placed under scrutiny, become a microcosm for a larger claims on a larger world. More recent work is just completed book on awkwardness, which should be out soon. So again, the question of the body and what it means to be awkward. And this is a ranging work from 18th century books on manners all the way into contemporary film and television. With pit stops in poetry along the way. And then another book that he's finishing is The Creaturely. So again, we have this question of the body, and his talk on The Creaturely will be tomorrow at 10:30. So please join me in welcoming Alexander.
Thank you all for being here, either in the room or elsewhere in other rooms, but being here together. Thanks also for the invitation, and to Ron, as well as the Humanities Institute and ASU more broadly. The title, it's not so much a talk as a conversation, I would hope, today. And so, obviously, as we progress in this, or even sometimes regress, we can have this also a conversation online, but also here in the room. And I trust that hopefully we'll get a dialogue going, because to some degree, I already said earlier, I don't really know that there is just one answer to this question about where is the sport in sports writing. But I want to have a sort of a stab at particular kind of different versions of this, how we might actually approach this, and why we can think about why this is in fact an important question, and the answer also. So the first sort of starting point really is that we could think of sport as being something that is ubiquitous. It's everywhere, right? We know this. Yesterday, Ron very kindly took me out for a drink. I was counting, and we went to 2 separate establishments, not too long. There were at least 5, I counted, different games being televised at each of these. So that's actually some kind of a crazy number. We know this, right? It's big business. It's but what I want to figure out today, and want to sort of think about a little bit, is how sports writing fits into this, and more specifically, as the title indicates, where the sport is in sports writing. So it's not just that it's big business and everywhere, but it's actually that we have this. If we go to the next slide, please. That there is it confronts us really, sports, not just with the fact that it's big business, but with very, very many timely topics in 2024, right? Race, class, gender, disability, nationalism are only a few that I've put in here, very, in very, very sort of obvious ways, that, again, we could talk about at length, right? What's important, though, or what is sort of interesting about this is that this is a relatively unreflected field at least 20 years ago in academia. Not now, but about 20 years ago. And I think a very good way of, sort of phrasing this is in a book by Hans Ulrich Gumbrecht in praise of athletic beauty, and you'll see that in the quotation here. If we can have the next slide. The reference to the marginality of sports functions as a good-humored warning against taking its pleasures too seriously. It may be cool for an intellectual to present himself as a fan of the once cursed Boston Red Sox or the once mythic Notre Dame football team, but to confess that watching sports is a central component of his life makes him look rather pathetic in the eyes of his colleagues. That's Gumbrecht in 2006. We'll go back to those male pronouns at the very end of the talk, or the conversation. This is not the case anymore, I believe, what Gumbrecht is describing. Partly because there's been a proliferation, really, in academic writing about sports, right? And as we can see in the next slide, I've just put it scattered together. It's changed really quite drastically. The place we're sitting now, here is obviously in this kind of arena a good example of this. There are serious university resources being put to the study of this phenomenon. And there are also examples that include writing. As you can see at the very bottom, that's my bookshelf. Before I came out here, I went through all of them briefly. But the year's best sports writing has been going for a while and has actually been more and more and more, successful as a way in which we would look also at sports writing. In the same way that, this has been proliferated, also what counts as sport has, of course, massively increased, right? And that's something that's happened, over time. Again, if we look at things like skateboarding would be a good example, right? But we get these kinds of different kinds of sports, and actually certain things that used to count as sports do not anymore. That's a whole different other discussion. But for all of this attention that this suggests, I think there's still room for us here to pay attention to a wider, multifaceted dimensions of sports in sports writing. In other words, to ask, again, to come back to the question where the sport is in sports writing. And I think I want to put to you, and if we could go to the next slide, that there are at least two ways in which we can enrich the way to think about this topic. And the first one is language, and the second one is history. I'll say much, much more about the first one because I want us to get a conversation, but the claim about history is always sort of in the background. And you can see how this then links to what Ron was saying earlier in the introduction about the through line of the interests. I think the reason why these are sometimes maybe forgotten, language and history, might be a sort of a hangover of sports writing being a minor or unimportant genre along the lines of the Gumbrecht quote that we saw earlier. However, sport is, of course, ancient and a rich, world with extraordinary history, and so is sports writing itself. And I think one of the ways in which we can approach that is by looking just simply, very old-fashioned way of looking and thinking about the multifaceted meaning of the word sport in sports writing. So, very simple exercise in the next slide. You can see how the dimensions clearly bring out the different ideas and topics. And if you now ask yourself and substitute the word sport in sports writing for all of these that are all definitions, actually, of sport, of the word sport, They are correct definitions of the word sport. Where is the diversion in sports writing, the entertainment, the fun? Where is the lovemaking in sports writing, the sexual intercourse, or the amorous exploit? Where is the activity providing diversion, entertainment, or a pastime? Or, in fact, sometimes maybe most important, where is the piece of intellectual or literary playfulness? Where is the jeu d'esprit, or the writing characterized by this in sports writing? Right? So you can already see how the playfulness is something that, of course, I'm doing here too, right? But there is a form in which we have, really, I think, we want to bring together the importance that we have understood of the homo ludens, right, of the playful man, and the idea of wit, that there is something intellectual and at the same time bodily about sport. And I think we want to bring that into sports writing, and into sports writing also in the way in which we have this, or conceive of this as a genre or a form of writing that is broad, that is generous. And I think that's a really, really important point, right? I think a lot of sports writing, or a lot of way in which we have asked ourselves the question about what is sports writing, has considered sports writing as a small genre. And what I mean by that is not necessarily only small in importance, but actually the length, the actual length of the way in which we think of sports writing is something that, because of the way in which it has been mediated to us, mostly through, long pieces, and they are fabulous, right? The last New Yorker had a great piece on Djokovic, right? But it's a very, very particular form, and it's a very valuable form, but there are lots and lots of others that we don't really consider very often. So novels, right? Poems. Ron and I just talked about, how about thinking about Elizabeth Bishop's, one art, about, the art of how we master the art of losing as also something about sports, right? Drama, or in fact letters, or in fact mixed media. So these are all different forms of writing and sports writing that might give us a different sense of where's the sport in sports writing in all of those different multifaceted ways that I pointed towards earlier can kind of come to fruition. I want to just give two examples, and if we can have the next slide. And there are loads of them, right? I'll just give two. Leanne Shapton's really delightful and really, really interesting multimedia experiment, I think, called Swimming Studies. And something completely different, which is the correspondence between two very canonical male authors, Polster and Kurtze, right? So there are lots of other kinds of examples, but I just wanted to pick two that are relatively contemporary, but that would speak to us in different ways, and that would speak to us in these different ways of thinking about sports and sports writing in different kinds of representational modes. So as you can see in the next slide, Shapton has it's a great book that I really recommend. It's about swimming, obviously, as you probably have gathered. But the reason why I picked it up here is because it gives some texture to something that, Fleshman's book, great book that just came out, Good for a Girl, right? I know that some of you have read this, probably. We get to think about femininity and size and the female body, for instance, and how this relates to sport and sports writing. And the point is that the size of the different forms of representation of the visual and the verbal here on the screen, right, make us think about how we can represent different forms of thinking about sport artistically, both visually and verbally, in the writing, but also in the actual photograph and in the juxtaposition of these. And then let me go one further as a Blake scholar. This is also where the competition between different kinds of media different kinds of forms of representation, of writing and the visual, come into play, and that there also is a sport. That in fact, when the visual and the verbal, like in this case, don't exist just naively next to one another, but are actually in some way in a competition that one could very easily liken to a form of athletic relation, right? So this is just one example. The next one that is maybe more obvious in some way comes from the correspondence between Oster and Coetzee, which again is not, it isn't in any way sort of obviously about sport, but you will see how actually the way in which these authors think about writing is itself inflected through the way in which they think about sport and vice versa. And I think that is something that is very important. That is not an obvious, a piece of sports writing that we might pick up, right? But actually it is important to the way in which we want to think about the relation between sport and sports writing. Again, where is the sport in sports writing is also where is the sports in writing, that actually writing itself can be something that is akin to a sport. And we can talk about this later too. It has a lot to do with training and the way in which we sort of think about the relation between, again, representation and the body. But here's just a quote from the next slide from Coetzee, where, and this is a slightly longer quote, but I think it's worth reading. Like you, and he's talking in the to Oster, or he's writing to Oster. And again, it's a different kind of, think about the letters, the exchange of letters. No, we'll go one prior, and one prior. That's it. The exchange of letters is also a form of competition, of course, right? Always, especially between two very important male authors. So like you, I think that watching sport on television is mostly a waste of time. But there are moments that are not a waste of time, as would, for example, crop up now and again in the glory days of Roger Federer, a person who actually has inspired great literature. Foster Wallace is the example. I scrutinize such moments, revisiting them in my memory. Federer playing a cross-court backhand volley, for instance. Is it truly or only the aesthetic, I ask myself, that brings such a moment alive for me? It seems to me that two thoughts go through my mind as I watch. So this is a self-analysis of sports writing. One, if only I had spent my adolescence practicing my backhand instead of, then I could too have played shots like that and made people all over the world gasp with wonder, which is of course the fantasy of the novelist, right? Followed by two, even if I had spent the whole of my adolescence practicing my backhand, I would not be able to play that shot. Not in the stress of the competition, not at will. And therefore three, I have just seen something that is at the same time both human and more than human. I have just seen something like the human ideal made visible. Right? So there's a long stretch here between Roger Federer's backhand volley and Coetzee, the Nobel Prize winning author, thinking about what it means to write actually and what it means to represent, and that the two have actually a meaningful relation. So writing itself also becomes like a sport, or at least akin to, in the way that it is something that we can, as literary critics, as people who are interested in the humanities, as people who are interested in cultural representation and analysis, can really take from and should think about when we think about sports writing as something like this that doesn't look anything like, let's say, a feature on a particular kind of sports person that might appear in a different kind of outlet. Which is not to say that those are not good, right? It's just to say that we want to be broader in scope. So this is about excellence, beauty, and competition, right, for Coetzee. All hallmarks, in fact, of poetry, of course, for him too, right? So in the next, when he goes on, we can see this. What I would want to note in this set of responses that he's just described is the way in which envy first raises its head and then is extinguished. One starts by envying Federer, one moves from there to admiring him, and one ends up neither envying nor admiring him, but exalted at the revelation of what a human being, we're in the Humanities Center, right? A being like oneself can do, which I find is very much like my response to masterworks of art. What an honor to belong to the species that he, occasionally she, exemplifies. Now, we're back, I promised that we would be going back to misogyny at one point, even in the people who's, here in the two examples that I think are really, really interesting and very, as I said, capacious ways of engaging with sports. And yet here is a playfulness, a sport, trying to be a sport, trying to be a wit, that actually ultimately does not date very well, right? And yet it gives us an idea also that, for this author, I mean, I'm not saying that because of that one should disregard this passage. No, that's why I included it, in fact. That is part of the way in which we have to also think through sports writing, not just as forms of celebration, and that the sport and sports writing is not just always a winning formula. It is also a way in which, Ron and I just talked about this 10 minutes ago, well, a little bit longer, how sport is actually mostly losing. There are so many more losers than winners, right? Always. By definition, has to be like that, right? So, there's also that much more bad sports writing than there is good one, right? And you make mistakes like this, right? So, anyway, it's just to say that I think these are two examples that I think point towards a much more capacious way of thinking through how one writes and how one has sports writing. Okay. How one can think about sports writing in those ways. And let me just, end on a note that I promised to talk a little bit about history, but I won't bore you very much so that we have time for questions and conversation. But you can see three very, I think, quite striking examples here that reference back to the very first slide where I referenced, race, gender, disability as things that sports present us with now, and now are very, often to be said, this is the way in which we can, think through these topics. And actually, that has been the case for quite some time. So, one is the very famous Cribb-Molyneux fight in the 18th century, which, was basically the big fight between not just races, but also between continents, between different kinds of political systems, right? America, Britain, etc., etc. So, there's just one example. The other quick example is the importance of disability studies. This is not something, again, that is, that is something that we can learn from if we look at the historical sources. So if you look at this newspaper clipping from the mid-19th century, this is about a cricket match that is, between two disabled teams. And what does that conjure up for somebody in the 19th century? Actually, something that, we also need to talk about now, which is that disability sport quite often is the sport of people who get disabled in wars, which is so often, likened to sport, right? That have lost limbs somewhere in combat of, for, at least on behalf of a nation that we earlier saw, is also used in the way in which we kind of market and represent sports to one another. And the other one would be, I did a bit of work on that on training, on the question of what training is and how it actually affects and the way in which we there is a whole history to the way in which we now think of it as something that is A, normal, and B, necessary, and C, even sort of intuitively, evident that Ron would go running every morning, or, feel like that there is some kind of, not just a need, but that there is somehow a link between that activity and the way in which you behave as a citizen. it's really, really wild. And that exists and has existed for a very, very long time. So these are just examples that I think also make clear how the way in which we think of when we think about sports writing, we can, and what the sport in sports writing is. It is, yes, that fun, that sexuality, that playfulness, but it is also that intellectual sort of engagement that we need when we look at this type of writing, and that we want to demand some of it, when we're looking at this kind of activity from us, to pay attention to these. So maybe as a way in which to end is one way I with some of my colleagues have tried to sort of open up this way, in this more capacious way of thinking about sports writing, is to look at sports writing across a longer period of time, and also in different kinds of genres, what I mentioned earlier, moving from the smaller, more typical writing of sports writing, genre of sports writing, to the larger, the novels, the ways in which you have a type of writing about sports and the body and society across all sorts of sources that we might not even sort of consider. And that's what I just put up in the next slide. We're trying to do in the Bloomsbury Handbook of Sports Writing, which is under contract. This is, as you can see, 1790 to 2020, so it's a pretty long period. And I'm co-editing this with my colleagues, Cassia Boddy, who wrote a great book on boxing. Her book's fabulous. It's a really, really fantastic piece. There's a whole bit on Muhammad Ali and John Keats in it, too. And Chris Young, who's in the German department in Cambridge too. It's a collection of 30 commissioned essays on the intersection of sports and writing mostly in the Anglophone world, though there's some other kind of text in there too. And we're looking at everything really, from training manuals to memoirs to polemics to poetry to novels and to blogs. Right? Also the way in which the type of sports writing, or what counts as sports writing, has changed dramatically from, say, Hazlitt's The Fight in the Romantic period to, blog writing, sports live blogging in the internet, in the age of the internet, of course. Right? There's canonical stuff in there, right? Norman Willett, The Fight, Tom Brown's School Days, but we've also looked at stuff that isn't actually as obvious, things that I mentioned earlier, maybe that is slightly more hidden, or is in especially in texts that don't announce themselves as sports writing, or that are about in certain books that are very, very well studied by people who normally don't really pay attention to the importance of the sport. So if you look at next time you read Daniel Deronda, and you look at for archery, there's actually lots and lots and lots of stuff there that tells you a lot about the representation of the female body and its male and the male gaze in the 19th century. It's really, really dramatically interesting. So anyway, this is just one example. I'm very glad to sort of report that we've got a great array of people that will contribute. Everybody from people in sports studies to literary figures to actually sports writers themselves, whose primary job it is to actually get money for this, like Wright Thompson from ESPN. But again, I mentioned to Ron scholars like Jim Chandler or Hans Ulrich Gumbrecht or Grant Farrad or Claire Pettit or Amy Collinger. I mean, there are plenty of them. I don't want to list them all, but there's an interest in the variety also of their approaches. So the point is really to reach wide audiences with this, but also to answer and get to the point where I started from, and maybe we can go to the last slide, to really answer this question of where the sport is in sports writing. Mm-hmm. So in editing a book like that, I'm at least trying to pay attention to these wider issues that I discussed, right? To these different kinds of multifarious ways in which one can interpret this activity of sporting, right? Both as an activity, in fact, as a description. It's play, fun, but also very, very serious. It's got rules and timing, just like history, and it is also a particular challenge to us in the way in which we represent ourselves, each other, and the way in which we read this kind of representation of the body across, a history and across genres, especially. And so to explore that fun and I think connect its linguistic power, its real representational power and its visual power to many of the concerns that press upon us today, with which I started, and understand how they're historically embedded in something that is longer, that we really, really, can gain a lot from if we pay attention to it.
Mm.
So that's the gambit, as it were. I hope to, get some conversations about that.
Great. Well, thank you, Alexander, for that. And really, it's just the opportunity for conversation then, too. This is obviously a rich field, and you've laid out a lot of material, so it's a chance for all of us who are interested in this problem. It's a great question. It's a great provocation. So maybe we can ask a few questions and have some audience feedback on this. One of the things I was interested in is how the medium is unique. So the difference between sports writing and, say, how it's different from watching sport on TV or a documentary or photographs or something else. Like, what can writing do that is unique or different and shows up differently than, say, other genres?
In relation to the sport itself?
Yeah, well, either way. I mean, you can take it,
Well, I think to some degree, it depends on what aspect of sport you want to then look at. So because sport, what I was trying to do at the beginning is show just how wide it is, how incredibly broad a topic it is, right? So if you want to, depending on how you want to tackle it, depends on how your approach as a writer will, depend on that, on what aspect you want to, where you want to, and how you want to engage with it. I don't think, there are certain sort of things that are very, you can sort of be all Lessing and Laocoon about it, that there are certain kinds of content parts that really would be more successful in a linguistic representation. So let's say, right, the narrative, the sequence, the arc of a game, of a play, is very, very immediately related to the way in which I have to write about it or I read about it, right? So that would be one way. But I don't think there's something distinctive only in the content. It's the way in which, what you do with it as a writer, really. And of course, that writing itself is actually in many ways very akin to, right, the activity that, it's repetitive. It requires skill, and yet it is skill and art that come together. You can, so you can draw the sort of very, and that they might be quite old-fashioned, but I think they're still relatively effective ways of understanding why writing might be a good way of exploring the sort of intellectual depth of the activity, right? Rather than something that would be through its genre very fixed. But other genres can do it too. Painting can do it. Caricature can do it. Film can do it. It depends on how, writing has one massive advantage, which is it's just been, it's been around for, sports writing has been around for, since antiquity. So, you've got a lot of sort of examples.
Um,
I actually want to pick up on the content part of
Mhm.
your response. Like you say, it depends on, what you do with
Yeah.
as a writer. And I'm interested in the racial
Yes.
aspect of that content, and more along the lines of what's not there, but also what's there. And
Mhm.
I just feel like, the answer to your question is, it's everywhere and nowhere.
Yes.
It's all over the place, and you can hardly find it if you don't look carefully. In any case, I'm just curious whether you're familiar with people who are writing about how race is handled in writing,
Right.
and in talking about sports. So what's in my head right now, I'll eventually get to the
Mhm.
question, is like when I watch college or
Yeah.
professional football, for example,
Yeah.
the commentators
Oh.
are really charismatic,
Mhm.
wonderful speakers. But what I notice as a viewer is they make very racist comments
Absolutely.
about black players,
Mhm.
male or female. Doesn't matter what the sport is. It could be track, certainly could be the two I mentioned,
Mhm.
football, professional or college, and certainly basketball.
Mhm.
So the best example I could think of with football is, the best black athletes get described as athletic,
Mhm.
and the best white athletes in the same position get described as intellectual.
Smart. Yeah.
They're really smart,
Yeah.
they can figure this out, which is complete crap.
Yes.
But I'm just curious whether, as somebody who's working on this topic, whether there are people who are commenting on this and trying to make sense of it, because, I watch sports all the time,
Mhm.
and I see it all the time, and because of this, I often boycott my watching of sports, because I just get sick of it after a while, and then I love sports so much, I go back to it, then I
Mhm.
get sick again. So
Yeah.
do you know where I'm coming from with this question?
Oh, very much so. Yes.
Okay,
Yeah.
all right, so I'll
Yes.
stop there then.
And actually, the interesting thing to me is that it's something that you have in, it's an international phenomenon. So it's not just the US phenomenon. So you watch, I grew up in Germany and then lived in the UK. You watch soccer. It's the same kind of rhetoric, right? It's a smart play. Is always, interestingly enough, a muscular player, So yes, is the answer, and actually there are people who talk about this intelligently, I think, and have, and this is something that, it's interesting. I have no idea about how these journalists are now trained. Also, I don't know that. So that would be one interesting answer that I simply can't provide. There are places. I think I taught a course on sports writing a year ago or so, and we looked at Dave Zirin's The Kaepernick Effect, which was a really interesting kind of. It was lots and lots of different things, but it was an accumulation of the types of writing and the types of report that came in the wake of Colin Kaepernick's kneeling and then being ostracized, blackballed, etc., right? So I think, and within that context, a lot of these kinds of issues, are raised. So, yes, there is that body of work, and yet it doesn't translate into the way in which, bafflingly, into the way in which we, watch, or what we hear on television. Another way, I think, another two maybe not so intuitive ways of answering the question are, what was really interesting was to look with students at the way in which 18th and early 19th century boxing, writing on boxing, described the body, and the black body in particular, and the eroticism that was involved through the language. That was really, really interesting, right? And was very revealing to, I think, a lot of the students in the room, and to me too, that this is not something that's happened, this is not something that's happened in the last 5 minutes. It's something that's, actually these kinds of metaphors, this kind of rhetoric, right, is actually deeply, deeply connected to the way in which we respond to the content. But not to just the sports content, right, but to other, to the racial content too, in it. And as an even less sort of intuitive response, I would say, yes, we as literary critics, at least, have to think about how sports is also part of the things that we do. How playfulness, we often want to celebrate, but actually often it really goes wrong, right? And we have to figure out a way in which to articulate how this type of playfulness is a sport that can be also quite serious. So, my go-to example is, you need context and historical context for an illusion, right, to understand an illusion. Well, if you think about the word illusion, it has the sport in it. It is ludere, right? It's to play. It's to play, and in order to be able to play, you need to understand the historical and the longer context. So these are three very different kinds of responses, but I think they all connect. And they make us want to sometimes just switch off my commentators, but we have to, unfortunately, reckon with the fact that, yes, that is one way in which sports writing is defined, and we need to sort of get ourselves out of that, and make that a new standard, and make the way in which we think about it a new standard, be it in journalism schools or in humanities centers or through events like this.
Thank you.
Sure.
I got a two-part question, and that's not really a two-part question, it's just two questions. The first question is, I was thinking, you mentioned the canonical text, and I wonder if you were teaching exemplars of the sports being in the sports writing, what would be those canonical texts? And then the second question, not the second part, the second question is, what are your thoughts on headlines and the way that they shape how we perceive the biases or whatever the presentation is in the actual writing? And I don't even know if anyone's ever done a study on headlines, but I would be interested to hear about what you think between what's inside of them and then how they are presented, and especially now in an era where most of the sports writing is being presented online.
That's a fascinating question. I have not done a study. I don't know whether it exists. I will this afternoon try and find out, because that's, I think, a very, very, especially as a writer, you know that the headline might not be yours either, right?
Often isn't.
So that's a really I'm the most. The only way I can respond to that, and from my own experience, is that I have to kind of figure out how to call the course. What was the title? And it's hard, right? Because what you don't want to do is you want to maybe draw attention to that is one of the things that you want to engage with in the course. Is not a celebration and hagiography of all of these sports writers, but in fact, that horrible moment when Ann Coulter says, shut up and dribble, right? That's, or shut up and play. That would be one way in which to do the course title, right? Just saying that's exactly what we're going to engage with, right? Critically. But the way in which that is systematically across media done, and especially the way it is simplified, I don't have an answer to, but I think it's fascinating. And the question would be, what type of sports writing, especially because headlines are so often so playful when they're good, right? That's a really, really interesting sort of question of craft too. The first question about the canonical text, are you thinking about sort of historical texts or?
Yeah, maybe. I mean, I think I read somewhere about, it's like some boxer in the 1800s was like the advent of the sports superstar in America. I can't remember his name, but it was around the time of mass media that we started getting sports pages and creating sports heroes. So maybe from around that era, as far as you want to.
I mean, I think that there are lots of sort of very important texts in that era,
Mm-hmm.
and texts that might not be as known today as they could be.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you know, Hazlitt's The Fight. A lot of the stuff is about boxing, and I'm very happy to send any kind of references. If you email me, I'm more than happy to share. I think there are others like, you know, that are linked more to literary kind of projects also. So Mendoza's autobiography was a Jewish boxer who's very, very interesting sort of project, in fact. But I think in some way the question becomes also what one is after. So what one thinks of as sports writing, as I mentioned, like Daniel Deronda. That's a novel that nobody really genuinely thinks about as sports writing, but we can do, right? Hunter S. Thompson, right, starts out as a sports writer. In fact, on ESPN, crazily enough,
Yeah.
and writes really interestingly about race actually in the NBA back then. You have it in the 19th century. There's some great, and I'm going all over the place now, right? But Egan in Boxiana, all of these 18th century reports and writings and reflections on boxing are massively important, right? So I think these texts exist, they just don't, they're not actually thought of quite often in the same way as the way we now think of as sports writing, which, as I said earlier, I think is quite often limited to a very short type of genre, right? They're not books that are, novels anymore, or, parts of, if you say, larger projects that in themselves, have an aspect of them that is interested in sports. So that they don't announce themselves in the sort of obvious, this would be in the sports section, right? I think that's the role of, literary and art, critics who, go find them and say, we need to actually read this in a different way, in a new way. But I'm very happy to share lots of sources.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know whether there are any questions online or
I want to share something with your second question. When you're talking about your headlines, I'm not sure if Americans media, but in Asian context, when some female players wins, they'll use beauty or her names and win the medal. But as for the male, just the male's name. So somebody said that they try to. They try to use the beauty of female to catch more attention. I think that maybe could be the headlines, the different. So I want to ask Alexander, do you find any interesting finding from the gender issues?
Oh yeah.
From the back to 18th century until now. Is there some differences?
Oh, absolutely. And again, I'm very happy to share some materials, and this is where I think this form of communication in the classroom can really do, and this is where the language but also the historical can really shed light on these materials for people who are really interested in sports, right? So I can again share from my class one of the most interesting sort of we did an exercise that was like an NPR 1 minute radio segment and something that you had, or 1.5 minutes. And one of my students did something on women's soccer, right? Which was actually, again, and we're going back to war and sports. In the early 20th century, in Britain, more popular than men's soccer. Which, I mean, that, just, and then she did some research on this, and this suddenly blew up, right? I mean, again, I was on my way here. I read Good for a Girl, Lauren Fleshman's new book, which I think came out. I think
really good.
Last year,
Yeah,
or the year
2 years
before.
ago.
It's a really, really, it shows and it tracks, pun intended in trying to feel, but a way in which it's not just about how the female body is represented, but it's also actually a real ignorance about the female body by the people who are doing the representing, which are generally men, right? So that actually, but there is another layer even. So my answer is in a way twofold. One is, yes, we need to study the kind of participation of women in sport that has existed, and in sports writing, in fact, that has existed over many, many years and centuries, right? To avoid precisely the sort of little misogynistic joke that Goethe is making, or was making it. I think he's trying to be clever and saying, I'm not a misogynist, but actually it didn't quite work. On the other hand, we need to do precisely this. We need to show that there is, even people who are invested in this, a tendency to focus on away from let's say what a particular kind of positioning, social positioning in particular, right, along gender, but also class and race, of course, can do to the way in which one is represented in the writing itself, right? So, that's going to be one of the big challenges, I think, in the way in which you think about sports writing, that the playfulness and the seriousness can, be really productive ways in which to engage that into the future too, right?
I was wondering if you all have particular texts you like, the contemporary stuff that you like. Oh, this for me is a good model. I mean, all of your writing, you've read sports writing, so I'm wondering if, what's some of your touchstones or something like that?
Tom Wolfe. Something, it's like Junior, it's out NASCAR, it's like Junior Johnson, that's it. Junior Johnson is the last American sports hero.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, one of the best openings.
Really?
Yeah, I when you talk about the playfulness and like approximating this idea of sport in the piece, I think he, to me, Wolf, Hunter S. Thompson, I mean, all these guys are writing in an era where the white man is king in the world, and so I feel that liberation in their writing. They could do anything, and they try out a lot of stuff.
Well, I don't really have anything I would say is the best example, because I don't do a lot of reading in that area. So the one thing that's coming to mind is a book that's probably 40 years old. It's called The Diamond Mind by Dick Crepeau. It's a history of baseball between the world wars. And it looks at gender, race,
What's it called?
politics. The Diamond Mind. Baseball, America's Diamond Mind is how it goes. And Dick Crepeau was my former chair at a university where he's at Central Florida, my first job at a graduate school. And, as a person who was being mentored by him, I was really invested in what he was invested in, and that turned out to be sports in general, but especially baseball, because he had been a big fan. But I learned a ton. I, for example, never went to a hockey game went to a hockey game with him, started reading about hockey, but can't remember
Yeah,
some
yeah.
of the good books about it. This was 30 years ago.
Yeah.
And he continues to write a column today called Sport and Society. But that's the only one that I could really think
Yeah.
of. But it's an excellent study of history of politics around baseball in this country.
Dave Zieren's stuff for the nation. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
that intervention he had, we were all talking about Colin Kaepernick, and,
Mm-hmm.
There was this conservative right-wing discourse of how hallowed, the national anthem is before sporting events, when he historicized that by saying, actually, that practice only goes as far back as after 9/11.
Yes.
Like, not even 2 decades old at that point,
Yeah.
so, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. That's the power of history sometimes, yeah.
John Edgar Whiteman on basketball.
Yeah.
I haven't read that, but I know what you're talking about.
But there's some short stuff, you think maybe Esquire or something that he's published, but yeah, him writing about basketball is miraculous.
And there are really some classics. I mean, The Mail of the Fight is a very, very problematic book, but it's a
Which?
Norman Mailer, The Fight.
Oh, yeah,
Um,
yeah.
But, you get Beyond the Boundary, by C.L.R. James. It's a great example of thinking about race in sport, but globally, right? Through cricket and through thinking about empire. I do think that it also depends on, where and what format. I mean, if one is interested in journalism, I do think it's a fascinating fact that Hunter S. Thompson, the very, very beginning of ESPN, when it wasn't this big, massive behemoth, was writing columns for them.
I do wonder,
Crazy columns.
to what degree industry has then shaped genre, or shaped what you say or how you say it.
Oh,
right?
massively.
You know,
Yes. Drastically.
Going back to headlines and all of that, but,
Drastically. I
word
mean,
counts,
and it's getting shorter and shorter, or it's changing at least. I mean,
And the arc of it, it's like you got to get something in right away. You can't build stuff up, and a lot of the craft work that you see in the craft of nonfiction, you can't. Some of that stuff you just can't do because it just takes too long to build it out, or people just don't seem to follow it in the same way. I'm interested in those kinds of problems anyway.
Or the idea of columns versus being able to write in prose. Right? Like training as a journalist and thinking about the metrics and how long you can rank a sentence, right? The sentence is too long in columns, it's a really long sentence versus if it goes across a page.
I hadn't thought about that.
Yeah.
The other thing that popped into my mind as far as your question, Ron, was Randy, I'm blanking on his last name, but the book is Blood Brothers. It's about Muhammad Ali and Malcolm X.
Oh, yeah.
Maybe 6 or 8 years ago.
That's a good, yeah.
Randy Norman, Randy Thompson, or somebody like that. Maybe Randy Roberts. But I thought that was really good. But I didn't actually associate that with sport until your question. I associated it with, racial politics and post-World War II America. But it certainly, went into the life of Cassius Clay, who became Muhammad Ali. So that's a good one. It's a solid one. I'm working on a book on a completely different topic, and 2 of the people I'm writing about were reading this book. And one of the things I do to build rapport with my interviewees is just kind of mimic what they're doing. Like, I'll eat what they're eating, or in this case, I'll read what they're reading. And so that's how I came across that. So something to talk about, make them more comfortable.
Do you know that one, Body and Soul? It's This is about boxing in Southside Chicago. But it's this French anthropologist, and he decides to join this because he wants to follow these guys and their relationship to the street and the gym, and so he decides to join this boxing gym. And he almost gives up his PhD to become a Golden Glove boxer. And he's kind of adopted. And it's interesting because he's white, but he's French. And so, and his English has an accent and so forth. So and he's very committed to the sport. So his relationship to the guys in the gym and the families, and it's talking about how the families really support the athletes, support the boxers, and what these guys got to do, the discipline, the training, and then the relationship between that and what they're seeing just outside the gym. And so I found it really an interesting book that way, yeah.
Had you talked about the identity of the players in the sport and how they, like we talk about race, but for example, like tennis being a predominantly monolithic sport, or now baseball, not. So I don't know if you.
I didn't touch on this, but one of the great sports writing books, McPhee's The Levels of the Game, and that would be an example of actually through tennis precisely thinking through Arthur Ashe's position.
Could you repeat the title again?
Levels of the Game.
Levels of the Game.
It's a really, really great book. And through following this one game, looking through and linking the way in which Ashe plays to a particular kind of politics, to the particular kind of moment. But I think there are lots of examples like that that are also global, right? I mean, there's lots of interesting sort of Brazilian journalism on, or in fact African journalism on soccer and race, but on gender, and again on class, right? I mean, if we go back to the very first, not the very, very first, but the second.
Yeah, that slide.
If it's not, if it's too much, I don't worry about it. But it's there's a big question around about class, for instance, this right in soccer, and that a particular kinds of sporting activities also get associated with particular kinds of class structures. Now, this puts you into a weird position because, of course, would we want to abolish the working class really, and therefore it's sports too? Right? I mean, it's not as simple as it is portrayed to be sometimes, right? Or the question of disability in sport. Like if you look at that female body that is completely sexualized, though, in ways that actually mimic an ableism that is odd, right? In why you would present that in the way in which you would do a Sports Illustrated typical sort of swimsuit, publication. So I think the different ways in which that happens in sports, in the way in which sports writing articulates itself. But again, that happens. It has a particular kind of history, right? That we then need to be aware of, right? I mean, your example earlier about the linking of the national anthem with the military, in fact, which is a bizarre practice that is actually relatively new, right? Like so, I mean that's why I included it, right? That and with particular kinds of forms of sport too, right?
All right. Did the military fly over during like a NASCAR game or
flyover,
football
and
game?
also that the military are, here, for instance, the military are celebrated at the sports game. I mean, the army, the navy, and so on. Anything. What is the connection here between the NFL and and of course the connection is business, etc. I mean, you can sort of and CERN does this very well.
Well, but also like West Point, the sign on their pitch on this field of playful strife, we sow the seeds on other fields on other days. We'll reap the fruits of victory. And so that kind of linking.
Sports writing.
Yeah.
Yeah,
But the
that
linking
of the
between
two,
the
yeah.
military and the school, especially public school, private school, and particular kinds of forms of sport, yes. But the commercialization of the link between the two, in where the NFL is the most egregious example, is really, that's something that's relatively new, and that comes through. I mean, that goes back to your question earlier about how media is or particular kind of forms of media are shaping also new forms of writing, right? I mean, I think it's really, really interesting that we may at one point have thought of the game report as something that was akin to, say, the report of or the review of a play, right? But now, and it can also, the way in which this information travels now makes that almost redundant. However, it might not in the longer run, right? Because the information is so fast, actually, it might lead eventually to a different form of writing, where in fact you're not reading for the result anymore, for the actual who won and who lost, but rather for the narrative as to what happened.
It's the slowing down. I like this. It's the slowing down, the reflexivity, the ability to slow down and think through what's happening, through reading and through writing about it. Yeah.
Right, but you have to also be engaged with them figuring out, and this is what I mean with what is the sport and sports writing, is not something that will be fast or will be results oriented. That's not, and I think, plenty of sports writers over a long period of time know this. Levels of the Game is not about who actually wins in the end, right? You're not going to read it for, what happens, the reveal. And that's the bit where sport is actually showing you something about that has an analytical power, right? That only if you think, oh, I'm only interested in sports writing as a celebration of something or the other, or or actually putting it away, right? It used to be that oh fine, you can do that, but in your spare time, like the quotation from Gumbricht at the beginning. I think then you're really missing the point. But I think you're also missing the point if you're saying that sport is only one thing and one thing only, right? It is only the way in which, I don't know, the masses are indoctrinated or something like that. That's just not true, and good sports writing shows you that. And so that is part of where the richness of that sports writing, there's just a lot there that we can mine and understand. And we, I think, sometimes, stand in our own way, deciding a little bit too early what counts as sports writing and what doesn't. And I think, it means that we have to do more work, because it means that we have to read more, and we have to read more broadly and in stuff that we don't, might not even be comfortable or interesting to us at the first time round. But again, it is also requires some kind of training from us to engage in that, in order to to produce new forms of looking at this, very ubiquitous but often under-analyzed kind of cultural activity and literary activity.
You've spent time. You've written on training.
Yes.
And so I'm wondering if we can talk a little bit, maybe just about training manuals, people writing about training, how that is, because often when we think of sport, we think of what's happening on the pitch, what's happening in the field that day kind of thing, but like that whole other part of...
So that's it's a broad question, but I'll give you two answers. One is that if you, so I wrote a book chapter. It was called "What Is Training," that came out in a collection that Daniel Quinn did with Alex Tadi, called "Sporting Cultures," and my work there was about training manuals in the 18th century and how they actually then are, in a way, kind of a weird precursor of what we have now. So you read them, and you read training manuals that are about walking, actually, pedestrianism, big sport at the time, or boxing or whatever, and you read them and you realize, these are basically, if you substitute a particular, what the exact exercise is, it's pretty much exactly what you have now. It's just a radically different what is supposed to be good and what is supposed to be good now, right? So then it was, I don't know how many pints of beer and some mutton and whatever that you had to eat before you did this. But others are very, very similar. Sexual abstinence, all of that kind of stuff. That's a rhetoric that already exists. But what interested me more was how is that linked, and forms of training, how are they linked to success in sport? So suddenly the success of a sports person gets linked to the success of their training, and how that then in effect, or as a step further, mimic or mirrors their success as a citizen. And that's this, so if you're training well, and if you're keeping your habits, and if you're doing everything right, then actually the likelihood that you will be, and you hear the rhetoric already, right? Oh, you want to get out of, your particular kind of the situation that you described earlier.
Yeah.
What do? You join the boxing gym, you train,
Yeah.
etc. So the link there is still there,
Yep.
right? And that's to trace that and to make it, to look that up and to figure out when that happens. And when specifically it happens that it becomes a way of self-training and of self, if you like, surveillance, if you like.
Mm-hmm.
So the idea that you would train for yourself, not in order to then win a fight or something like that. In other words, why you would want to go to the gym is something that then it's tied up to the way in which you're supposed to be as a body and how to behave as a body, but also mentally. And then the links to religion were immediate also, right? The way in which training becomes a very, very repetitive and very, very codified practice, both of the body and of the mind.
And you have to believe.
And you have to.
You don't. I mean, you're not going to see the result today. You're not going to see it tomorrow. You got to believe. And
believe.
yeah.
So that's the one bit, and there's plenty of literature on this. The other bit, though, that I found sort of, and that's the bit that I still have to write, that I find sort of conceptually more intriguing is. Sport is one of the very few areas, I think, where that is true, where you need incredibly tedious, repetitive training in order to pull off that volley that we talked about with Federer. So the closest I've come with in an activity is jazz, actually. Right? Where the rules are clear. It's not like you can do whatever, right? But you have to train over and over and over again with a tedium to really make, if you like, the muscular memory so evident. I mean, so not evident, so unconscious that you're able to, in that one moment where the ball comes flying in this particular way or the other, move in ways that actually contradict totally the way that you normally would do.
That's right.
In order to improvise, in other words. Yeah. That moment where we've all had this, right? Where we sat on the sofa and we jumped out and said, I can't believe what I just witnessed.
Yeah.
That is the moment, that can only happen. The necessary condition for that moment to happen, for that moment of complete radical craziness, the basis for that is complete and utter boredom for years and years and years and years and years. And that's a curious kind of connection where, people who do this, and this is where I'm going back to the quote, so people who do this, athletes or musicians who do this, when you're in the presence of that, there's something that happens. I'm not sure whether I would use the words that Kurtz used, gratitude or something like that, or beauty, Gumbrecht was it, or awe or something. But there's something there that is very interesting, not just in the way that it does happen, that exceptional moment happens, of grace or whatever you want to call it, right? In its many different kind of connotations, that word too. But that there is something underlying that you need to also pay attention to, which is that tediousness. Right? And so that's, I think, what is intriguing, because that often gets forgotten. Right? All of us have that. We have these moments in our heads, and we like to celebrate them, but we quite often then forget or don't want to write about what happened before.
Well, this is where I think writing can do something that sometimes other genres can't do as well. I think writing can stay with that kind of friction and tedium in a way that other genres often swerve from or move away from.
That's the answer to your earlier question.
Yeah.
I want to say I agree, but then I know that I'm also prejudiced, right? I'm a literary critic. Of course I believe in the power of the word in that way, right? So I have no idea of somebody, like the Zidane film, right? The portrait, the 21st century. This is the bit where we need to broaden the discussion and talk to media people and talk to filmmakers and talk to
there are
artists
some good
so
films.
to have an understanding of what can certain things do that others cannot, right? Why is it that we go back to particular forms of writing when to others we don't, right? When they concern sport, it is what makes the quality of the writing. It can't just be that we go back to it because that's just circular, right? Yeah. So there needs to be an understanding and a tool set through which we can then, a toolkit through which we can then understand and analyze and articulate what really is so powerful, right? Why did you pick all the examples that you picked earlier? There's something about the writing itself, not only about the content.
I wonder about, you were talking about writing about training manuals. In I can't historicize them too far back, but I wonder about Rocky and what was the effect of Rocky on our study and fascination with contemporary training. So I don't know about what they were doing in the 1900s, but from the 80s on, like it feels like Rocky might have been a watershed for us being fascinated with what made a superior athlete, and then also this question of class ascension, right, that's connected particularly to boxing, because also boxing was our first sports heroes too in America, right? So the first athlete that could get rich was a boxer, at least here. So yeah, I wonder about Rocky. And even seeing that play out now, right, to Creed, whatever we're on now.
But the training montage and all this stuff.
But this isn't exactly. But this is the bit where it's actually, of course, a lie, right? Because, and this is where the film is the problem, right? Where you could say, the training takes what? Like 3 minutes. But it's true, the glorification of it in that way, absolutely. I think one would have to, I have no idea about films, but Rocky, by that time it's already, I think, a sort of a well-established, form of how also treat your own body, right?
Right, yeah.
So the woman has to disappear, right? And even if she's there, then, she doesn't feed you the piece of bacon because she decides that, she's going to monitor the way in which you actually treat your own body. It's wildly sort of over-determined, right? And yet it's very successful. And this is something where if you had to do this in writing, it's much, much harder. So,
Yeah.
you know, these long, long poems that basically, what is it? Kenneth Goldsmith, the baseball poem. It has every single word of all of the radio broadcast.
Oh, wow.
It's amazing. It's a great, great book. Sorry.
Yeah.
But I think that's where the tedium of a game,
Mhm.
right? For which you also need training, right? You need to know when to pay attention. I mean, if you've, you know, we've all been to baseball games, and you kind of after a while know when you need to pay attention and when you don't.
That's right.
But you know, at the beginning, it makes no sense at all. Like, why is suddenly everybody quiet? It makes, you know. I mean, certainly when I first arrived, I thought, and then it transpired it was exactly like a cricket ground. You know, the game lasts for 5 days, but you know that, you know, in this one particular moment, ooh, now that's an important over. How? It's through practice. Also as a viewer, like how to interpret, how to read, and maybe how to read repetition.
Yeah.
Some of the most fascinating bits in the correspondence and the Osterkircher correspondence are about what the point is to watch a game that you know, pretty much A, have no investment in, and B, that is very likely, you know, to be very, very boring and very, very repetitive, and yet you still watch it as somebody who knows that, you know, you should be writing, you know, there are other things to do. That there's something meaningful there, though.
I don't want to, maybe this is a question for offline, but I was thinking, you said you grew up in Germany and then spent time in the UK, and I was thinking about the idea of the American dream and how that's connected to which sports we value versus which sports we don't, and then I was thinking about how in the UK, soccer is the most important sport, and I don't know what the German dream is or the United Kingdom dream, and how that kind of national ethos shapes what sport the people pay attention to, which again, I guess would also mean which athletes are the most famous, and how the writing is shaped by the kind of national rhetoric that the nation tells its citizens about who it is.
So there are lots of answers to this, but I mean, but far and away the most popular sports are soccer in both countries. And I'm talking about now, in the last, you know, 30, 40 years. I would say the situation, I mean, the political dimensions of sports, certainly in Germany, you know, I mean, in the 20th century are so obvious that, you know, they can't underestimate it, and everybody sort of knows. Which hasn't actually, though, prevented, you know, German journalists, for instance, talking in very much the same kind of, you know, ways that, you know, you're referring to at the very beginning. Sometimes openly racist, then they have to resign. But, you know, there is still that and the UK is the same. However, in the UK, because the UK has a really weirdly, I mean, you know, given that a lot, like very, very many sports that we now play worldwide were invented in the UK. I mean, disproportionately, you know, and of course that has something to do with empire, etc. You have other sports that I would say condense the particular kinds of issues in the UK more clearly. So rugby, the difference between rugby union and rugby league is, for instance, a class issue in the UK completely. right, which has a fascinating background, right? The idea that soccer would be a working man's game or a working class game has also very, very distinct and has really developed, well, I would probably say since the beginning of the foundation of these clubs. I did some, I thought it was interesting work on when clubs form and when sports also get codified, which is also an interesting thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the rules of a particular kind of sport were actually wildly different depending on where you were, and the same is true for boxing until quite recently, actually.
Mm-hmm.
So the idea that everybody would know what the rules of football were, not so.
Mm-hmm.
But you have, I think in the UK it has led to more writing around many more sports, I would say, than in Germany. But I'm sure that a German sports historian, sports literature person will tell me about. There are some great, actually quite famous poems actually about footballers.
Mm-hmm.
But the writing on golf, the writing on rugby, the writing on rowing, the writing on, soccer, and everything from fever pitch to, Woodhouse, right, is very, very active, at least in the UK.
But is that what does the UK, like America says we're the greatest nation, right? You pull yourself up by your bootstraps, this is the land of freedom and milk and honey. Like, what does the UK say about itself? Do they say, we were the best back in the day, but now we're not? Or I don't understand. What do they say?
Yeah, some of them would say that.
Okay.
Some of them would say, we are the most interesting failures.
Okay.
And therefore, there is something about the irony of, we're slightly too invested in this.
Okay.
And yet we have, and this is the bit that, rubs people the wrong way. And yet, at the same time, the fact that I can have this ironic distance does mean that, in fact, I'm still as, I believe in a particular kind of superiority.
Yeah.
That's one version, right? So I think that is what a lot of soccer writing now is about, how British football or English football is not actually at all English anymore, and that's not necessarily the kind of rhetoric that you have in France, or whatever. That we need to get rid of, the non-French players, the racism that you have there, but rather that the money stream, that all of the important, soccer clubs in the UK are not owned. They're owned not by British people, but also they're owned by people that have partly nothing. They have zero interest in soccer. They just see this as an investment opportunity.
Yeah.
And that is something that, of course, then they get very, very upset about until their own club gets bought by, some enormous conglomerate, when they suddenly realize, maybe we're about to win something. So this is great. So suddenly they all change their mind. So, there is, and that gets written about critically quite often, and yet people still do it, right? So I think the way in which it's done, it's through either personal affiliation to a team, like in Fever Pitch, and it's been a while now, but that's still a powerful. Or in the way in which its analysis is about class and about money, which is, it's not surprising, because that's the UK's way of analysing itself generally.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Another, just to briefly, I think one fascinating bit is that if you go and watch all the footage of the hooligans in the 80s, they all have British flags. They all have Union Jacks. They do not have England flags.
Oh, that's interesting.
Right? So in the way in which a particular kind of form of nationalism gets suddenly filtered through differently, and that at England games you would have Union Jacks, and so that is something that is really, some people are interested in that, not that many.
Mhm.
And yet, you have, like here it is, you have De Montfort University, a university that really pays attention to this kind of, sports studies. They have serious people thinking about it and looking at this.
I would be remiss if I did not at least make a nod to animals in sport. Being the animal studies person, which is, and class in animals. So horses versus dogs. Dad used to go see the dogs race. And then, of course, you have dog fighting. And then you've got, even going back further, the bear baiting, et cetera, like going way back. So it's interesting to think about a lot of this also filtered through non-humans and how that thinks about, how we think about sport, what constitutes sport differently there.
Yes, but I think this is absolutely, so, and this is the bit where I would urge us to open up that arena rather than closing it off, right? So looking at the way in which, for instance, horse racing is the way in which, people write about horses and, especially in the American context, Seabiscuit, all of that, it's a source of great literary sort of material. The way in which becomes a marker in different kinds of essays or literary productions from the 18th century onwards until now. How it is just like boxing, always identified with that the animals are used in order to identify in a particular kind of. But that actually it is also from the very beginning part of sports writing. So. Isaac Walton's angler, right?
Oh, yeah.
The difference
Yeah.
between angling and fishing,
Yeah.
right, is class-based. That one is a sport that you do, and then you throw the,
You'll
throw the
meet
fish
Toby
back.
tomorrow, who does exactly this. He writes exactly on the history of angling
Right.
in Britain. Yeah.
And it's a great, and we still make that distinction, right?
Well, versus
So-
Moby Dick, too.
Well,
Right. I mean,
or do do you keep it? Do you do it for sport,
yeah.
which is much more for art, right? Or do you do it in order to, gain sustenance? In other words, it's a
Right.
class issue,
Right.
right? Do you need to eat? But then there are also other considerations that we need to think about, like in the tradition of Spanish-speaking literature. There are the writing about bullfighting, and this is we're not even talking about Hemingway. We're talking about a long tradition of writing about bullfighting, which happened. I still remember this, and maybe it's still like that. The part where the reviews were of the bullfights was not the sports section. It was in the arts. It was in the arts section in the Spanish newspaper. So that gives you an idea about where the interface is between the different types of, and the people who write about bullfighting were people that were akin to theatre critics and art critics. They were not sports writers that were writing about soccer and things like that. So you can see how, yes, we have to be ample and open and see the chance there. Not to immediately close off and say, that is not a sport. We don't want to have anything to do with that kind of cultural practice. No. Read stuff that might not be comfortable to read in order to figure out why certain people think about this type of writing as sports writing or art writing, right? And how we can figure out the connection between the two. So animals play absolutely crucial. And apart from the fact that, you don't have to go down to animal studies and so on, but most of the implements, most of the balls, plenty of leather there, right?
Yeah.
You've
The
there's,
pigskin.
The pigskin.
Yeah.
After all, so It's from everything from, you know, actively engaged to, you know, a necessary part in order to create the objects with which, you know, this activity is performed.
Well, I hope you'll join me in thanking Alexander, and thank you. Thanks for this conversation. I mean, really, I think just all around.